Hi there. It's great to see you again. I previously had you on the Maximus podcast a little while ago, but this is our second episode. And for the people who haven't seen the first podcast, my esteemed guest today is Dr. Rand McLean, who's a regenerative and sports medicine physician here in Santa Monica, California, and is an advisor to our company Maximus. And the reason that I decided to come back and talk to you today is you recently published your new book, and thank you for giving me an advance copy here. It's called Cheating Death: The New Science of Living Longer and Better. And I thought not only is it a great opportunity to obviously tell people about the book, but this is a topic that everyone is asking about, which is how can I live longer? How can I live better? There's a lot of conversations, a lot of other books that are coming out around this subject. And so I thought it'd be great fodder for our audience here to talk a little bit more about that. So thank you for having this
No,
conversation.
thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Awesome. So why don't we just start out with basics and definitions? I'd love for you to just explain what is the field of regenerative medicine and how did you get into it?
Great question. There really isn't a specialty for regenerative medicine like there is for sports or internal medicine or, nephrology or something like that. So regenerative medicine is kind of sprung out of what you just referenced, an idea of, hey, what can we do to live not only longer but better? And I use the term health span. I've heard it defined different ways to include living longer but living healthily for that time period.
Right.
No one wants to spiraling into old age, right?
Right.
So the book was designed first, the title, to get your attention,
Sure.
and based upon what I see as people's desire to get the most out of life. I mean, a typical patient is someone who has, worked a lot and hard to amass a retirement pod of some sort, and then wants to live longer. And I have, for example, a great number of law enforcement officers in my practice. They're a great example of guys and gals who unfortunately will work very, very hard, sacrificing their health along the way,
Right.
and then get their retirement. And this is stuff you can look up. I think the average still is about 2.5 years after retirement, they either die or have something very disabling happen to them.
Wow.
That's not a good trade, man.
Right.
So, we want to hopefully protect these people, all people who are interested, from spiraling if they can. Catch it, delve into this as soon as you can, and certainly reverse it, which is possible too. I hope I make the point very clear in the book that, whatever you did, mistakes you made in the past are not necessarily going to set you up for disaster in the future. A perfect example is smoking. I think they still say that after 5, maybe it's 6 years of smoking cessation, for all intents, I mean, there's still going to be carbon in your lungs, but the cilia grow back and your lung function goes back. So, just because you might have screwed up a little bit, thus far, doesn't mean you can't do it now. So I hope I answered regenerative medicine.
Right.
It really encompasses this idea of health span.
Yeah.
And optimizing your health here and now.
Well, I think that's such a hopeful message to give people. And I used to actually do a lot of smoking cessation treatment. And so I always say, look, you can teach an old dog new tricks, but I think it's also an empowering message that, yeah, you can perhaps undo some of the damage, and perhaps the body does have an intrinsic ability to regenerate and heal. And so hopefully by using some of the techniques that we're going to talk about today, people can achieve that health span, live longer, and live better.
I would argue it definitely has. I think most of us agree an intrinsic ability to bounce back. I think if we're really honest with ourselves as physicians, right, what do? We sort of nudge the body and then get out of the way of its own healing process. We set that in motion, and I think really, technically, you could probably say that about just about anything that happens when the body gets better, right, from disease processes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to explain the difference between biological and chronological age.
Well, chronological age is the obvious one, right?
Right.
You were born 365 days prior, so you're 1 year old. Biological age is the idea that, and it's really easy for the layperson to understand, maybe in these terms, if you look at somebody who says, yeah, I'm 40. And you go, oh my God, really? You look like you're 70, man. Poor thing. Because they've just done a lot of things the wrong way is the best way to put it, easiest way to put it anyway, right? They smoke and drank to excess, and I'm not talking about apple juice or carrot juice, alcohol. They didn't get enough sleep. They underwent too much stress for whatever reasons. I mean, a lot of people can't help some of that stuff. The working 3 jobs and supporting 6 kids. I mean, I get that, but it is nevertheless what happens to some people. And we've seen the opposite, where somebody's 70 years old, and you go, wow, that person looks like he's 45.
Absolutely.
Or she. That's the concept of biological age. And we can actually investigate this. The markers, we call them, for biological age are so controversial, understandably so, because we'd have to go through several generations before we could say, yeah, see, we were right about that one. But that said, we can use something called DNA methylation, for example, that we very directly correlate to age. And so we can say, well, this person's amount of either hypomethylated or hypermethylated points on the genes relate to this chronological age and this biological age. And in that way, we can, I think, who cares about the accuracy so much as we can gauge what's working and what's not, to not necessarily reverse aging, and this gets into semantics, but slow the aging process, improve your health. How's that? Okay. And that's what's important, because, we were talking about this before. There's so much information out there that's dubious.
Right.
And it isn't necessarily proven one way or the other. There's good reason for it to be at least a speculation, but we just don't know. So this allows anybody to say, okay, well, here's my starting biological age, and I'm going to initiate these protocols and then evaluate them later. So if it's precise enough, and DNA methylation, I think, has a precision of about 6 months.
Okay.
And I'm just using that one because I think that's probably the best of them, but telomere length is also used to some degree. Now, there's ways that test these, whether it's DNA methylation or telomere length. Some are better than others, so that comes into play too. But using these methods that are precise enough, we can then gauge, okay, how is this working for me?
Yeah.
Which I think is the most important.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like there's some controversy regarding the validity of the test, meaning if it says my biological age is 31, it's not sure if it's exactly 31, but you're saying it's reliable enough that if we're tracking it over time and engaging in interventions, it can at least tell us if we're accelerating or decelerating aging. Is that correct?
And that's what we're striving for. Yeah, I mean, I've got an app out there right now that I don't talk about, and yet here I am talking about it probably for the first time publicly, because I'm using it as an example of the difficulties. We can use some of the NHANES data, right, the publicly accessible data, and draw correlations based upon numerous studies and lots of data points to say, okay, this is associated, this level of, say, homocysteine, for example, is associated with early death, premature aging. And this one isn't. So we can come up with some pretty good information based on that, but pretty good isn't excellent. And I would put, DNA methylation, for example, in one category and homocysteine in another category. So, the rub in all this is finding what the best biological markers are and using what we do. We're using, multivariate regression analysis, and that's something that's going to be perfected over time, necessarily over time, and using the mathematical models we have. But we're getting better at it for sure. Now, if you have a biological age app, we'll call it, or a system of some sort, and you're 50 years old and it tells you you're 25, we're probably not dealing with the most precise, certainly not the most accurate. I think it's reasonable to suggest that we can not remove, that's not the right word, but ameliorate, say, 5 years worth of aging to date, where we can be pretty confident that, this person's probably biologically 5 years younger than their chronological age. So that should give you some feel as a layperson, where we are in all this. And not just the measurement, but our ability to improve our health span. Now that kind of begs another question, right? So we all want to live longer and better. And we found through studying centenarians and people that do live longer that really what we're doing is we're not stopping the disease processes. We're not even slowing them down. What we're doing is we're postponing them.
Okay.
So it gets even more complicated, and you're following me with,
Yeah.
with estimations of biological age, because we're really not convinced that's how it happens. With the study of centenarians, it's like you might not get what everyone else gets for 10 years, 20 years, even 30 years, but then when you get it just like anybody else, and you still deteriorate just as quickly.
Yeah.
That's the point I want to make, where these biological clocks, again, I think are more useful for measuring what your protocols are doing rather than where you are in life.
Yeah, I think people like the vanity metrics sometimes. I don't know if you've seen Brian Johnson. I think he has like a leaderboard of DNA methylation and claims he's about 10 years younger than his chronological age. But that's what I was wondering, like, what is the realm of possibility? Is minus 5 years just about like the most amount of reasonableness?
Well, again, it comes down to semantics, but that's my point, is that, yeah, that's how we're saying it, but is that what it really means in the long run? I mean, I think that difference of 5 years might reflect 30 on the back end if you continue to, follow that which we believe at this point in time in science.
Sure.
And will change in a few years, maybe, or not. Certainly it'll get better, more finely tuned. But if you can maintain that, then will you get an extra 30 on the back end?
Yeah.
That's really what we're doing here. And I'm not sure this fellow's name you're talking about, but is he the guy that's in his 40s and
he's out here in Venice. He's spending
he does
$2 million
everything
a year.
like all he does is try and live. I thought it was like they estimated he was at 5. Does he estimate he's like 10 years younger than?
Apparently,
or is that just
he's
his
number one
subjective?
on his own leaderboard. So
Gotcha.
I hope it's working. God bless him. So what's the name of the app? Can people download this?
It's the Death Clock, we call it. Again, get your attention, right?
There you go. That's okay. So you can check that out on the App Store. And then, is there a particular DNA methylation or telomere test that you recommend for the people who are really curious about this?
So for DNA methylation, you want to use the Horvath method, which is, I think, considered by everybody as the best method. There's a company that I like to recommend called TrueAge. Because they're up to about 800,000 of these points that are either hypo or hypermethylated. And I think Hannah over there told me that they're going to be up to around, it's either 1.2 million or 1.4 million pretty soon. So you're getting better and better power and better, what's the right word to use statistics terms? Well, you're getting better data, period. And when it comes to the telomere test, which I don't think is as good, I'd say it's probably, the precision is closer to, say, 18 months. I think it's generally agreed. But you want to use it's called HQ fish. So you're not just taking a mean. What you're getting is a number of, say, these lengths, which are shorter, these lengths, which are a little longer, and these lengths are longer too. Because you can understand how it'd be very confusing if you had a bunch of short ones and a bunch of long ones. You think your mean, which it is right here. That's very different than a mean, the same mean that's grouped together through a bunch of points spread out more evenly, right? That's a very simple way of understanding the concept, because you do want to know what some of these differences are, and particularly if they're a lot longer, a lot shorter. A lot longer could imply cancer, for example. So again, that confounds the process of evaluating, because generally speaking, longer telomeres are better, right? And ditto, if you've got a bunch of short ones, what's going on? Are they all short in my liver and things are falling apart there? You don't want to know, right? So HQ Fish is the technology, and I believe it's LifeLength, which is based in Spain, has the best process for that so far.
Okay, awesome. So just to summarize, Death Clock app, so you can check out your biological age. If you're interested in DNA methylation, you can do TrueAge's DNA methylation test. And what was it called?
LifeLength.
LifeLength has a HQ Fish if you want to figure out telomere length. Or you could just use the mirror test and see if you look good in the mirror as the cheapest one that I always recommend.
I mean, that's a great place to start, right? Because that's what, again, even a layperson can do that, as we talked about earlier. You can see when someone's not too healthy or not the way they did back in great-grandma's time. And I will add, with the Death Clock, we intend to get to the next iteration where we'll include all that data in one. So the hope is that with the NHANES data and telomere length and DNA methylation, we'll be able to fine tune that even more so that again we get the differences in protocol
absolutely
assessed better. Yeah.
And as you were saying, it's not quite to the point of necessarily being the ultimate source of truth, although hopefully that specificity will improve over time. But at least you can use it to track the efficacy of your interventions.
Due to its sensitivity, if we're going to go along those lines. Yeah.
And so speaking of which, let's talk about interventions to improve health span. So let's start with nutrition, because it's probably one of the obviously most fundamental of the health behaviors. There's so much diet debates that happen and debating about blue zones and centenarians. So I'd love to just hear your professional point of view on how should people think about diets if it comes to optimizing quality of life and health span.
One size does not fit all, and do what works best for you, therefore. And that's what I see, for example, looking at centenarians. And you asked for my opinion. It's simply my opinion. If you look for proof, good luck, because most of the studies do anything but provide proof. The studies are so flawed that you really can't depend upon them. I mean, do you remember when broccoli was good for you, and then it wasn't, and then it was again? And same thing with salt. Salt is not good for you, and then it is if you're this kind of person. So, buyer beware as usual. In my opinion, by the way, again, since you asked for it, and I get to do the art of medicine now, I think with the blue zones, it comes down more to another factor we probably don't stress enough, which is the human bonding and having the what do they call it when you have a network to relate to and fall upon if necessary and whatnot. I think that's clear. I think that's very clear. Wouldn't you say in the blue zone studies? But when it comes to nutrition, I think there's some basics. You're not going to go around eating Twinkies and survive as long as people who are getting nutritious food. I think it's pretty clear, at least on an artistic level, that non-processed foods tend to do better for you, and there's probably some good theoretical models that support that too, because it's likely to be more nutritious, right? Not just calorie-dense food. I swear there's a big difference between fresh-caught fish and stuff I have to buy at the market, and same with fresh-picked anything.
Fair enough.
But beyond that, I think that I've witnessed, for example, in clinical practice, men and women that use the ketogenic diet and have a wonderful time with it. Whereas others, they can barely get in the gym and work out on a ketogenic diet. They just need the carbs.
Yeah.
And I'm in that category, by the way, if anybody cares. But I can certainly relate to it. And then I can generalize about it too. I find that people who are endomorphic tend to do really well with ketogenic diets. And it makes sense if you think about it, because they're not getting the muscle glycogen as easily. But because they hold muscle so well, that fat burning that they're training their body to do works well, as opposed to, I would say, you and me both, right, tend to be ectomorphic. My goodness, I would lose as much or more muscle as I would fat, and that's a losing battle. Right? It's robbing Peter to pay Paul. So we would probably have to do the protein and non-starchy carb way. Yeah. So that's just a perfect couple, not perfect, but a couple of examples that hopefully get the point across. It really depends upon not only your makeup to begin with, but you're probably going to eat differently if you live in Ecuador. Yep. Meaning at the equator where it's nice and warm all year round, versus in Minnesota where it's cold for all but maybe 3 months. Yeah. Right, if you're lucky. And then, as I was saying the other day to some people, you get it all figured out. You know, where you live, what you do for a living, what you do Monday through Friday versus what you do Saturday and Sunday. That's another factor. What time of year, what sport you're involved in. And then what happens? You age another couple of years, and you got to not start all over, but you got to make adjustments just because of that. So the message is, again, one size does not fit all, and you got to adapt, and you got to observe. And that goes back to what we were discussing earlier, I think before we started, about be your own best health advocate and monitor these things yourself.
Yeah. That's a great point, because there's so many health influencers out there. They have their particular points of view about the best diet, if there even is one. And what may work for them may not work for you, and to your point, may work for different body types. People are different on the diabetes spectrum in terms of their levels of carbohydrate intolerance. So you do got to find what works for you. Yeah. And I'll ask you a couple quick takes on specific controversial nutrition topics right now.
Let's do it.
Meat and red meat. There's a stereotype, especially if you live in LA, that meat, and particularly red meat, is bad for you in terms of lifespan and cardiovascular disease. What's your opinion on that?
Well, again, I'd be generalizing because what we just talked about, but I don't think there is anything inherently bad with meat, whether it's red meat, white meat, or whatever. There are things that you can differentiate between the two. For example, the meat from salmon has a lot more of the omega-3 fats than, say, a ribeye from a cow. And if you are in the category of suffering from, say, coronary artery disease, you have plaque in the arteries, and that stems from inflammation, you're probably better off having more salmon than red meat simply because of the omega-3s rather than the meat itself, if that makes sense. Because you don't want to further any more inflammation without going into the prostaglandin synthesis and all that stuff. It's just, we'll stop there. But meat per se, is it bad for you? No. I mean, it's like the whole cholesterol debate. Cholesterol is bad for you? Really?
All right. So next kind of controversial nutrition topic. Everyone's talking about refined seed oils as kind of being the devil right now in terms of these vegetable oils that are commonly used, soybean oil, canola oil, as being pro-inflammatory and the cause of a lot of health problems. Do you have a particular opinion on that? Do you advise patients not to use those?
Again, it goes back to individuals. I mean, this gets a little more complicated because why is it bad for you? Because you're separating it out from its natural source, and that might have something to do with it. And there are other things. We were talking earlier about polyphenols that might be combined with some of those oils. If you ate the apple and the seed, for example, I'm just making that up. You get some of the things that might counteract some of the things they're talking about that are bad with the seeds, which I don't necessarily agree with.
Sure. But do you have preferred cooking oils, for instance?
Well, from what we've studied in terms of cooking oils, that makes a difference because, for example, certain oils you can heat up to a certain degree without changing the structure. And off the top of my head, I'm sorry, I was trying to think if I remember, but I think my wife corrected me just recently, and I thought canola oil you weren't supposed to fry with, but she corrected me, and I think you can. But anyway, there's certain ones where they have a lower temperature at which they change
right
into something not so good for you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, this kind of gets into the Gundry type stuff, right? Where leptins are included in a lot of things that are good for you if you separate them out or look at them only for what they are, out of context, are bad for you. You can probably tell by my face about how I feel about that, right? I mean, again, you got to put it in context, I guess. I'm not trying to be Byzantine or avoid the question, but it's kind of a loaded question.
Yeah.
If I made my own oils for whatever reason, I have olives, for example, on my property. Why would I not use those?
Yeah. I guess people don't count olive oil because it's technically a fruit-based fat versus it's not technically a seed oil. So I think people kind of put the olive oils and butters in a different category versus the canolas and the peanuts and soybean oils that are commonly used to fry stuff at restaurants. But yeah, it's kind of a controversial, unresolved kind of area when it comes to nutrition. So I was just curious. If
you go, say you're in a population where you're limited, like in Guatemala, and you have a lot of, this isn't going to be a good example because they got plenty of corn, but let's just make it up where they only have certain access to crops, and that's their only source of nutrient or calorie dense food to get the oils from these seeds. That's your that's your mainstay. So you're probably not. Again, I'm going to make too many assumptions here, but if you're otherwise nice and healthy and lean, and that's your only source, then how would it be harmful? In other words, in our society today, a lot of things that wouldn't be harmful otherwise are so because 100 million of us, a third of us, have fatty liver already and are grossly out of shape.
Yeah.
So these things would be more harmful because they could be the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Yeah.
Now I'm finally spitting out what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Again, though, it goes back to it's all variable depending upon where you're coming from and where you start. Right.
Makes total sense. Let's talk about polyphenols. Speaking of nutrition, so can you explain to our audience what are polyphenols? Where can you find them? and what impact do they have potentially when it comes to preventing cancer?
Polyphenols are easy to identify because they pretty much represent all the colors, right? Like, great grandma said, have lots of colors on your plate. Well, that's what it's about. Polyphenols have a lot of different effects depending upon the polyphenol you're talking about, but largely antioxidant effects. And to your point, a lot of them have anti-cancer effects. And for those of you that think this is getting into woo-woo medicine, stop, go to your computer and type in, for example, green tea extract. So we're not even talking about which polyphenol, comma cancer. And at least here in LA, you'll probably, if you Google it, Sloan Kettering will come up as probably the top 2 or 3 results. And you can read all about how we know that green tea extract, because it contains EGCG, epigallocatechin 3 gallate, can fight cancer. And I do include that in the book. I know that was a pre-thought of question, because I break down how my old, he's not old, but my former organic chemistry professor spelled out how it works through the formation of these things that are very similar in nature to what we used to treat cancer with these high-powered chemotherapies that we use. So polyphenols, for example, I call EGCG chemotherapy light.
Wow. Yeah.
Because it does have that effect. It may be the reason why some of these cultures that do drink a lot of green tea have fewer incidences of cancer and do a lot better than we do. You could argue it has to do with just the ability to sit down and drink some green tea amongst friends, like we talked about earlier, might be the key. But there's certainly a theoretical reason behind why it works. And if you look at some of the work with Dr. Morey, Morre, treating cancer using green tea extract, there's a product, Capsol Tea, which is, in each capsule is the equivalent of 16 cups of green tea without the alkaloids, the stuff that will act as a stimulant. And he's got documented at least 100 cases before he died, unfortunately, where cancer was reversed using this alone because it was caught early enough.
Yeah.
Don't misunderstand any of this. If you got stage 4 cancer, you need to go see an oncologist.
For sure.
If you've got any form of cancer, you need to go see an oncologist, someone who specializes in this. But I think I documented there in the book, with prostate cancer, which is a slow-growing cancer. So you would think, for reasons of the way chemotherapy works with faster replicating cells, it works better. Well, prostate cancer being slow, chemotherapy really shouldn't work. But between some metformin and some green tea extract, been cancer-free for at least 6 years. Yeah, without having to have anything surgically removed or anything like that. And I have other cases in my clinical practices of patients who decided, while seeing their oncologist, hear me, to go ahead and implement that as part of their plan. And so far, so good. Do we have absolute proof that it works? In our world of RCTs and the preponderance of proof we require, no. But again, it makes sense theoretically, and we have some evidence where people decided to go the non-traditional route, and it appears to have worked pretty well. Yeah.
And as we say always in the podcast, this is not medical advice. Obviously, work with your physicians.
Absolutely not. Right.
It's not a replacement, obviously, for mainstream cancer treatment, but it could be a potential adjunct in consultation with your oncologist. And there have been some published case studies of people incurring liver damage from ECGC supplements. So when people if they're assessing, their choice to do that, how can they make sure they're getting a high quality supplement? When you advise patients when they just try to find herbal supplements?
That's a great question. Typically, if it's not third-party tested, run away. And you surprised me because I wasn't sure you were going to get to that. But was it the EGC? Was it the green tea extract? Something in it that caused the liver problems?
Don't know.
Or was it contaminated product? Yeah. Right. They don't know. I've never seen it, but one of the ways we can prevent against it is to test. We can do assays to check how the liver's doing. AST, ALT, and GGT are ones you can ask of your doctor if you're doing this by yourself, and certainly if you're with a qualified physician, they'll be following you. Yeah. but I would argue in that case it was a gentleman I'm thinking of which sparked the interest in it. I think he was in his 40s, right? Who got severe liver damage. The quality of the supplement came to the fore. And again, I go back to third-party testing.
Yeah.
Most supplement companies will boast of it if they're doing it, and I argue they should, because there are a lot of rules when it comes to supplements, but very little enforcement.
Right. Yeah. So speaking of supplements, I'd love to hear your favorite supplements for promoting longevity. For instance, a lot of people are talking about NAD+ / NMN. There's debates between the Sinclair group and other folks about what's the right form to take. So I'd love to hear your point of view on that
This
one.
is so much fun, isn't it? I mean, we're both nerds, so
Yeah.
again, this is why you probably, well, you always need to be your best health advocate, but you should always have help. And that runs into what we get criticized for, right? A physician who treats himself treats a fool. It's better to have another pair of eyes for so many reasons, because it's so subjective. And it is variable. So you got to have the ability to assess it independently. Because, for example, with NAD precursors like NR and NMN, I argue they're really for people like, and I hope, if he hears this, he's not going to get mad, although he's got plenty to do besides listen to this podcast, right? But Sinclair, if you read between the lines, as I've tried to do, it seems to me he works out maybe once a week. Although he says different things, it seems to me, based upon how many times he takes his metformin, which he uses on the days he doesn't work out, and the NAD precursors, I think he sticks with NMN.
Yeah.
That might have something to do with the fact that his mentor, Lenny Guarente, owns one of the companies or whatever. I don't mean that in a nasty way. I'm just saying, why wouldn't you get it from your buddy if you could? But the best way to generate NAD is through exercise. And that might change us to the new topic, from nutrition to exercise as being one of the pillars of health span improvement. I wouldn't necessarily, I personally don't waste, and I counsel other patients on not wasting money on NAD precursors because you should be exercising.
Yeah.
It's not cheap. It's not a budget buster,
Right.
but there are so many other supplements that I would suggest are more beneficial for an athlete. For example, I would jump right to beta-alanine, for example, which is going to break down into histidine and L-carnosine, and L-carnosine has its own principles, properties that help with anti-aging, including the antioxidant ability. And we were talking earlier about the ability to buffer cellular acid. Huge, especially for an athlete.
Yeah. I know you mentioned specifically in the book that's potentially a supplement that can lengthen telomeres. Is that right?
Well, through a circuitous route, right? Because you need NAD to activate the sirtuin genes, which can activate. I mean, they're all so interrelated. That's what's so cool about all this is that, whenever you're activating autophagy, the sirtuin genes, affecting mTOR, these processes of regeneration are all being activated, right? They're all related. AMPK activation. They're all linked to this process of regeneration, whether it includes cleaning out the garbage in the cells, fixing the DNA in the cells. So if that's what you mean, without NAD, these sirtuin genes are not activated, and that process of autophagy is not. So, but again, do you need to have the supplementation? The argument is, most of that is probably going to go to the liver. Yeah. If you're ingesting it, and then you've got the IV use, though, which there's no way that could only store a whole gram, intravenously. We've got people in my office that are doing that in about 40 minutes or so, as opposed to 5 hours, which it takes a lot of people because it just makes you feel crummy, we'll say, to do it any faster. But that can't all be taken up by the liver. And so that might help you. There's a fellow doctor in Springfield, Missouri, that is using it for drug treatment and having a lot of success, recreational drug withdrawal and stuff. I see. So there's something that goes on.
This is IV NAD+.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Not IV NMN or NR. I don't think that's even possible, but maybe. But yeah, I think there's some efficacy. But again, for which individual?
Right. Do you have any other just general supplements that you like and recommend for
I just mentioned beta-alanine. Anyone who's active, I think, will love that one. It's an unfair advantage. It should be, restricted by WADA if they're restricting half the stuff they're restricting. No one gets enough vitamin D as in Delta,
100%.
vitamin D3. I argue no one can get enough of vitamin B as in Bravo, the complex of all the B vitamins. We've just evolved we haven't evolved actually. We have progressed, as it were, into all the stress. They call them the stress vitamins.
Yeah. In
the last 300 years, 300 years ago, we're herding sheep for a living.
Right.
And now you just wake up and look at your iPhone and you get stressed out at all the stuff that's going on in the world, right? So we can't get enough of the Bs. They don't store very well. We were talking about the possibility of overdose. I've never seen it. It'd be really hard. I think you'd have to do a lot of sitting around, barely fogging a mirror, in life to overdose, and taking a lot of vitamin B to overdose on them. So I think those, and the magnesium probably is another one. These are all sounding pretty basic, right? But it's the basics that are required.
That's what we're here for.
I see oftentimes, you can see the cellular, at least in red blood cells, magnesium content, and so many people are either close to the low end or below it. And I argue the high end, like LabCorp uses things like 6.8. You'd be better off at 7.4, or in other words, anywhere above the average, because it's so beneficial to your health. And we forget, we're burning through our magnesium too. Remember the Krebs cycle, or citric acid cycle? You probably remember it as, because you're much younger than me, right? We need magnesium as well as manganese and CoQ10 and zinc and all the B vitamins to turn food into usable energy. So arguably we're burning through our magnesium too. And that's a hard one to supplement because it doesn't get absorbed very well, right? That's why they make milk of magnesia.
That's right.
A very poorly absorbed one, and arguably they're all poorly absorbed, right? So you were the one that turned me on to magnesium taurate as an alternative to magnesium bisglycinate.
Yep.
L-threonate, we know, crosses the blood-brain barrier. So, I mean, you could probably speak to that better about how magnesium affects the brain, not just musculature, right?
Yeah. That's why we use magnesium acetyltaurate. There's specifically studies that show that 45 milligrams has better brain absorption and comparable to 405 milligrams of magnesium glycinate, citrate, and other forms. So it's very potent, essentially, at crossing the blood-brain barrier. And for us, it's an advantage because we can squeeze it into a little multivitamin versus most forms of magnesium you literally have to take powdered scoops of, right? So yeah, those are all great recommendations about the vitamin D, which everyone's deficient in. In fact, when we did a study at your offices of testing men in LA, 66% of people were vitamin D deficient and 100% were suboptimal unless they were supplementing. And I was surprised. I was like, it's sunny here in LA. You wouldn't think that's the case, but we're indoor creatures. So almost everyone should be doing that. So in our building blocks, which you helped consult and design, we have vitamin D3, vitamin K2, all the B vitamins that you mentioned, magnesium acetyltaurate. And then speaking of the polyphenols, we just added in the new version, this is the first time we're publicly announcing it, we added a European bilberry extract called Mertro Select, which has been well studied in randomized controlled trials, which has one of the highest potencies of anthocyanins, the 36% anthocyanin content that contributes to that dark, blue-purple color. So maybe there was some grandma's wisdom in there about, eating your colors.
Definitely.
So those are great supplement recommendations. Let's talk a little bit about prescription drugs that are kind of hot for longevity. Metformin is a common one that people talk about. So obviously one of the most common diabetes drugs that has been used for a long time. But we're seeing healthy people who are not necessarily diabetic or pre-diabetic taking it for longevity purposes. So can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons of potentially healthy people taking metformin?
Yeah, it's a broad one, but metformin, first of all, lowers blood sugar, as you mentioned, and we know now that in general having blood sugar in a range, we don't want it to be too low because we need it for survival. People forget that though. I mean, I have to say it out loud because people think we want to bury our blood sugar. No, that's how you can die. But we want to generally keep it in a range that tends to be lower. Okay, we have a measurement called hemoglobin A1C, and depending upon which lab you're looking at, somewhere around 5.6, 5.7% is the upper limit before which we call it pre-diabetes. Then you add another, half a percentage, or get 6.2 or whatever it is, you're full-blown diabetic. These are just categorizations, but I would argue for optimum health, I ask patients to shoot for, with some exceptions, because I think there's a genetic component involved there too, but some people just do better and they're not at risk and they're up there closer to 5.7, but 5% or below, I think you're looking good. And it not just taken out of context, but combined with a fasting insulin that's nice and low. Because it's more than just blood sugars, by the way. We find that higher levels of insulin present a problem as well. And of course, the two are intertwined, we hope, right? Unless you've got type 1 diabetes. Anyway, metformin does that. And we know, by the way, cancer loves sugar. Sugar tends to lead to inflammation. These are reasons enough to lower your blood sugar, but there was one pretty big study that set the wheels in motion to start studying metformin, where we found that people with type 2 diabetes who were using metformin had less morbidity and lived longer than the control group that didn't have diabetes and wasn't taking metformin. That got a lot of people's attention. And there's a fella, Dr. Niles Barzilay, I hope I got that right. I think he used to be based in Israel. He may be here because I think he finally got at least some of the NIH funding for what he calls the TAME study, targeting aging through metformin, which is really a culmination of a lot of separate studies and ideas he got to show, hey, metformin really is something that is considered anti-aging. Don't appreciate that word, but people get the point. Now, there have been subsequent studies which show that the effect, in hindsight, might not have been there in some of these studies. As we know, and I don't want to get into the details, but there can be a lot of flawed studies, and particularly when they're they call these meta studies, and they go back and look. Sometimes that can reveal some good stuff. Sometimes the meta-analyses have problems in and of themselves because there's just too much heterogeneity between the studies. And there's a lot of things that we don't need to get into. But metformin appears to help with a lot of things, including not all, but most cancers, because it does something called it activates something called AMPK, which sets into motion a lot of these healing properties, regenerative properties that we want to occur in the cell. Again, cleaning up the mess, autophagy. And it's not just in the cell itself, but mitochondria. Mitophagy is important too. We forget, and without going too far afield here, I apologize, but I think it's worthwhile to let the listeners know. I mean, it's not just the cellular health, but inside we inherit the symbiote, the mitochondria from our mothers.
That's right.
And it's we all learned it from high school, the powerhouse of the cell. It's where the energy gets created. And so the health of the mitochondria can make or break a human being, hands down. So that's important too. And metformin has been shown to help with those processes. The one drawback one certain drawback is that if someone has kidney disease, it can effectuate lactic acidosis. No bueno. Okay. But other than that, I think you are referring to, it works on complement 2 and inside the mitochondria. And all I can say to that is the studies say, yes, it can weaken the mitochondria, but they think that's actually part of the linchpin. If it's not the linchpin, it's part of the mechanism by which it tells the cell or it activates this AMPK process, because it says, hey, we're not getting enough energy. Now, if I go out and I talk to my athletes that I know personally, because this is not a study, this is just anecdotal, who got on it for anti-aging purposes, I asked every single one of them, I said, how's it affecting your workout? They look at me like I'm crazy. Why are you asking me that? Because I haven't warned them. And they go, no, I don't notice any change in my workout.
Okay.
Completely anecdotal. So I don't have any, the only slights I have against metformin is that some people will get digestive upset when they first start taking it. And so we want to titrate up from a small dose to a larger dose until you can get to the max dose of the extended release is 2,000 milligrams. And I recommend the extended release for fewer incidences of GI upset, which is just kind of a nauseous feeling.
Right.
Maybe some gurgling and some gas, but
Yeah.
if you do it slowly and with the extended release, you're probably going to be okay. And I found you probably have to get up to about 1,500 milligrams as a minimum dose. So 500 milligrams once a day is probably not going to do much for you. But again, even a max dose, I have not seen any effects on, what do you want to call it, athleticism?
Yeah. Exercise performance.
Yeah.
And what if your A1C's 5 or lower? You're not on the diabetes spectrum. Should those people still take metformin for longevity purposes?
I argue no, because again, the juice for the squeeze and the whole concept of hormesis, the J curve, however you want to put it.
So another prescription drug I wanted to talk to you about are omega-3s. So obviously those are available over the counter, but the common criticism is a lot of the stuff that's found in stores is rancid. It's been sitting on shelves forever. So there's prescription omega-3s. The most common is Lavazza, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is prescribed for hyperlipidemia. What about just like metformin, potentially using that in healthier people, because omega-3s have obviously healthy effects on the brain, cognition, etc. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on using omega-3s.
I saw a study recently that showed a particular brand of fish oil, we'll call it the omega-3s, fared much better than the control, but the control they used was mineral oil. So what do you expect?
You're right.
I've heard a lot of knocks on omega-3s, but if you look at the theory behind it and the studies that negate the expected beneficial effect, I would still stick with the use of consumption of omega-3s.
Mm-hmm.
It makes too much sense,
Right.
because it ends up making the prostaglandins, okay, that don't cause inflammation. It just makes sense. I think to get it in its usual state, in other words, combined with your salmon or whatever, or flax or whatever you can use, even some in walnuts, whatever. I think it's better for you for obvious reasons. Just like rose hips has flavonoids, with the vitamin C. So if you can obtain it that way, great. But I think when it comes to fish oil, you have to be wary of rancidity.
Yeah.
So if you're burping it up, that's probably not a good thing, good sign. It should be, again, third-party tested for purity. Fish have mercury. It better be boasting of its purity and be able to prove it. And one of the company's Designs for Health I like, because they actually attach a triglyceride backbone to the structure. So it's less likely to be used for energy and more likely to be used as a component of the phospholipid bilayer of the cell.
Right.
So it gives the cell that flexibility and not permeability, but flexibility. That's the best way to put it, I guess.
Yeah.
So I'm a big fan of. I think the studies show, the good studies show that you need at least 2 grams a day of fish oil, and I've seen 2 patients. Again, folks, this is completely anecdotal, but 2 patients with eating disorders that decided to go off on an omega-3 binge.
Yeah.
And I've never in this country, never again, that's, to say that is rare in medicine, but I have never seen anyone with omega-3 concentration higher than omega-6 and 9. Both these patients had omega-3 off the chart and minimal 6 and 9, at least relatively speaking. Not only very, very healthy and attractive females, both, but in good shape otherwise, whether you look at your labs, what they were able to do day in and day out, high energy and whatnot. So at least in my small world, I don't see any problems with omega-3s.
Yeah.
And I would ignore, I wouldn't say ignore, that's not the right word. I would scrutinize anything that says otherwise.
Right, yeah. Well, I think the advantage of the prescription form is it ensures the pharmaceutical purity, to your point. I believe Lavazza is in the omega-3 ethyl ester form. And I think it's commonly prescribed in that 2 to 4 gram range for hyperlipidemia, typically in those folks. Have you seen lipids improve on patients who are taking omega-3s?
Mildly elevated HDL.
Right.
But could I say it was due to the omega-3s? Absolutely, without question, no. Because, normally when you're seeing these patients, or when I do anyway, they're coming in for health optimization or making other changes.
Sure.
So it's hard for me to say Okay, this was the sole reason. It could have been maybe they picked up their exercise a bit.
Yeah.
Could have been they started drinking red wine. You know, that can, HDL-C can be elevated, and they're not sure. It goes back and forth whether that's actually worthless or worthwhile to see that elevation. So I couldn't say for certain, but it's supposed to help bring up your HDL. But more importantly, I would consider it for reduced inflammation.
Yeah, that's a great point, because a lot of us are living in a chronically inflamed state these days, and it's one of the best natural anti-inflammatories that are out there that don't have as much of the adverse liver risk as the NSAIDs.
And most of the studies that are worthwhile harp on the benefits of omega-3s as it relates to inflammation.
Mm-hmm. So in your book, you talk about another prescription drug, rapamycin, which is kind of all the rage right now in the longevity circuit. So talk a little bit about rapamycin, what it's indicated for, and why it's being used off-label now.
Rapamycin is a drug that is typically used as a anti-rejection drug. People know it, I think, most often as a kidney rejection drug. And it is part of the same family as, say, people have heard of erythromycin, for example, the antibiotic. Mm-hmm. But it is, there's a, well, what does it do? It's an mTOR regulator. And, the mechanistic target of rapamycin. So you want to, mTOR is responsible for cellular growth, mm-hmm. okay? And too much of that presents a problem. Again, we talked about autophagy, which is in opposition to that, right? Mm-hmm. I liken it to, I use the example of a kitchen. Mm-hmm. Right, you've got this cell that's creating these messages to other cells and the bone marrow and folding proteins that do some of that as well and provide function. And if all you do is do that in a kitchen, you're slinging food and you never stop to clean the pans or wipe the tomato sauce off of the recipe book, mm-hmm. at some point you're going to be creating something that's misfolded, that's not what you originally intended. It's, to use the food analogy, it's contaminated. Mm-hmm. And ditto for the recipe book. Is that 3 ounces or 8 ounces? That's the DNA reference. Okay, so you want to take some time out for that, and by lowering the activation of mTOR, you can effectuate that. The problem is you've got what we call mTOR1 complex and mTOR2 complex, and stop me if I'm going into too much here.
No, please, okay, cool. Like the details.
So we found that it's great to downregulate the mTOR, but not so much the mTORC2. So rapamycin used to be used to stop this cellular growth and allow the other processes to occur. Mm-hmm. And we were initially using it every day, but in a much lower dose than a kidney transplant patient, mm-hmm. for example. The current consensus is that we hit it once a week with a much lower dose, somewhere between if you're really petite, I guess maybe 3 milligrams up to, I've heard of some people using 20 milligrams. I think that's way overboard, and that might be everolimus mm-hmm. instead of rapamycin. But I'm taking 6 milligrams per day, and I think most of the people who are roughly in our age range, and I think more weight. But if you talk to Alan Green, for example, who's leading the way in this, he's a physician out of New York. Mm-hmm. I think he's up to like over 1,200 patients. I'm number 900 and something mm-hmm. with him. He has a very specific list of assays that he wants to see beforehand, and a lot of it has to do with your ApoE status as well as your insulin sensitivity. Because I think when you do rapamycin, you'll see some blood sugar increases. So there is some science behind using this, not just dropping it and basing it on your weight alone is what I was getting at. But again, this is all speculative. The theory makes a lot of sense. Going back to mTORC2, though, one of the reasons why we've started doing it once a week is because we find that if we decrease the activation of mTOR1, you'll also decrease the activation of mTORC2, and most in the animal studies anyway, the animals were being negatively affected by that, almost across the board. So we want to hit it and then leave it alone.
So that's what I was going to ask. By doing so, mTOR is important, I believe, for hypertrophy. Does it impair hypertrophy by doing this protocol?
It should. Otherwise, it's not working, right?
Fair enough.
And there's the rub.
So there's a trade-off.
Yeah, and so we're working on what we call rapalogs, where something will work on mTORC 1 maybe without working on mTORC 2. My way of overcoming that is, in theory anyway, complete theory, is hit, say Monday you use the rapamycin, and then either concurrently going under the assumption that their effective rapamycin might be, let's just make up a number, 1,000-fold on mTORC 1, 200-fold on mTORC 2. If you hit it with a growth hormone releasing a GH secretagogue, for example, then you might back off on the effect of rapamycin to, say, 500-fold on mTORC 1 and have no effect on mTORC 2. Okay? That's the hope.
Right.
And whatever we do, whatever we come up with, that's the idea behind it. If it's a rapalog or some other substance, we have others. I think I mentioned them in the book too, that some of the promising ones that will do just that. Then we might have this licked. Okay, but that's the reason why you're punctuating the week with the dose. Once a week seems to be the consensus right now. What's interesting about this is the anti-aging experts, whatever those are, the people that are in the field, not just the clinicians, okay, that we were talking about before the show, but the people in the research world, the PhDs that are in there, behind closed doors, 12 hours a day, the people that are in the, actually generating these studies, they're taking it too, without the RCTs and the data that you would normally be required before you say, I'm going to hang my hat on that one.
Right.
I think that's pretty revealing, although we could all be fooled.
Sure.
But again, that's why I go through the process as best I can, trying to dumb it down. That's why you see me hesitating, because I don't want to go too far overboard.
That's fair. Yeah.
Because it gets confusing for anybody, particularly because it's all interrelated. But
Right.
It's such an important concept. That's why I go to some links to try and explain it in the book.
Now, it is an immunosuppressive drug, correct? So is there any concerns about that, especially in this kind of age of COVID and upper respiratory infections, in terms of protecting our immune systems?
Yeah, we go back to the concept of hormesis again and finding that sweet spot. They did one study where they used rapamycin prior to patients receiving a flu vaccination, and those that took the rapamycin beforehand had a much better response to the same dose of flu vaccine as those who did not.
In terms of antibody response?
Yeah, I didn't stop taking rapamycin during COVID either, for just that hope anyway. Now, I also did get vaccinated, because we wanted to go to Switzerland, and that was the only way we were going to go. But so it confounds the situation a little bit. But we actually didn't get vaccinated until way later. You say, okay, well, that's a completely random story. But I did get exposed a lot. I found out during that time period. You talk even closer than this to a patient, and they tell you the next day, oh, by the way, I just got tested, I got COVID. So whatever. The point being, I guess, that the dose, the poison's in the dose as always, and it seems like that little bit of antagonism may step up the immune response rather than the other way around. We're using a really small relative dose compared to what's used for kidney transplants, for example. And the worst I've ever seen in any of my, not even my patients, one of my peers, a fellow doctor, said he had to back it down a little bit, meaning he stopped for his weekly dose once, because he got canker sores. That's the worst I've seen so far.
Okay. So let's talk peptides, which
Okay.
are also all the rage right now. Let's leave aside the illegal peptides, because I always tell people, if you're buying anything from a research chemical website, you have no idea what you're taking. You may not be even taking what you think you bought, because they're literally illegal. They're not regulated. So we're going to put that aside for now. In terms of the FDA-approved peptides that physicians can prescribe and you can get from a legitimate FDA-inspected pharmacy, what are the peptides that are interesting to you that you're using in your clinical practice?
There's a bunch there, but just to clarify what you're saying too, I agree. If it's not, the measure I use, because there's a gray area, if it's not available in a pharmacy, then I wouldn't touch it.
Right.
Is it approved by the FDA? Not necessarily, but it's not banned, I think is where the gray area comes. But if you can get it at a pharmacy, I think that's key for duh, purity's sake at a minimum. I think we're still running the risk with some of these because the studies are either written in Russian or some other language and not translated at all or very well, or they're animal studies or very early or not well designed human studies. But given that as a small clarification as to where I'm coming from anyway, first of all, the potential with peptides is staggering. If you think about it as tinker toys, right? So you've got hubs from which you can attach spokes and then attach to other hubs, and you can make these huge molecules or not, add different ligands, leave some out, change them up. Small changes of just one ligand can completely change the way it works within the cell. And that's pretty cool. I mean, think about all that we can do. And if you combine that, just a little aside here, with artificial intelligence and stem cells, artificial intelligence being used to come up with the most likely structure of this peptide for its design, and then being able to test it, making livers in a petri dish essentially, without having to go through animal trials. You're starting with human tissue right away. I mean, we can really speed up the process of a lot of development of healing peptides. That said, the ones that are very popular, I guess I could start with GH secretagogues. There's a few of those. Some of them, the GHRPs have been removed from the market a couple years back in May by the FDA. Don't really know why, because there are others that work by the same mechanism of action, such as ibutamorin, which actually isn't a peptide, by the way, so that's kind of a big asterisk. But we've got some that help with anxiety, for example. That's a perfect example, though, of what is it called? Solank and Simax. Most of the studies that I've seen are translated from Russia. And people will classify those as nootropics, I guess, because of its effect on the GABA receptors. You've got some like ceberlysin, also a lot translated from Russian, that work to enhance executive function in the brain. I can go on and on. And I try to list some of these legal ones in the book, and the dosages and that sort of thing, to give people an idea of what is available, and what it would cost, so that, again, the purpose of the book is to show, hey, I'm not telling you how to treat yourself necessarily, because that is very individualized, but here are the options, and find out what is best for you as an individual. But if you have any examples you want me to hit, for sure. I mean, God, there's so much potential there with peptides.
I'd love to hear your take on the other kind of popular thing right now is you mentioned growth hormone secretagogues. So there's a lot of anecdotal speculation about whether celebrities are taking human growth hormone or athletes. There's sermorelin, which is an FDA-approved growth hormone. I believe it's a secretagogue. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the any therapeutics that increase human growth hormone or IGF-1?
Well, for endogenous production, the growth hormone secretagogues work really well. So sermorelin works as a growth hormone releasing analog. It's the first 26 amino acids of that structure.
That's right.
There are others that work through ghrelin instead of growth hormone releasing hormone. That's pretty much, GH secretagogues in a nutshell right there. Some are more efficacious than others. The beauty of ibutamorin, which is a peptidomimetic rather than a peptide, is it's an oral. So it's much easier than having to keep refrigerated and, stick yourself with a needle every night right before bed. But it works through the ghrelin pathway. In terms of athletes and others using growth hormone, this is something that's misunderstood even amongst physicians. Growth hormone is the only FDA drug that I'm aware of to this day that is, again, FDA approved, but not approved for off-label use. So you've got 7 wasting disorder conditions like HIV, Prader-Willi, etc., that it can be used for, but it cannot be used. And they specifically state, I used to be able to quote it, but not to be used for bodybuilding, cosmetic, and anti-aging purposes, or something like that. So that's one reason why, if someone's using growth hormone, it's likely not been prescribed to them directly legally. Right. And I think they did a study, something like all the growth hormone sold, or no, that was for PD5 inhibitors, sorry, wrong story. But there's a lot out there sold, and it doesn't match up with the people with wasting disorders. But it is very effective. I don't mean to poo-poo it at all. I'm just talking about from a legal standpoint.
Sure.
If it's done properly, like so many things, it works really, really well to reverse the lack of the body's ability to continue making endogenous growth hormone. What affects that? Sleep. Not getting enough, because most of the growth hormone you're going to produce in a 24-hour period is during sleep, particularly that first hour where you go into deep sleep after you fall asleep. You have to have enough protein, right? The substrate from which growth hormone is made. It's a protein-based hormone. It's all these amino acids. I always get it wrong. It's 191 amino acids or 192. I think it's 191. But anyway, I get that wrong because the stuff coming from another country, without getting into politics, has an extra one on there. Uh-oh. And that's another reason to stay with a pharmacy, right? Or use the body's known way of making it, where you're sure that you're going to get the right product. And again, the only potential for abuse is when you go above what would normally represent a physiological upper limit, which we don't check for growth hormone in assays. We check for IGF-1, which is initiated in the liver once growth hormone hits the liver. Growth hormone has a half-life of like 30 minutes, I think. IGF-1, 12 to 16. So we measure that, and so I'm getting to the point of we use an IGF-1 of, say, 350 to approximate max. That's what you were doing, what you were producing when you were 16, 18 years old. And we can go into all kinds of sides about, well, what's natural, is that necessarily the best or whatever, but
is there any cancer risk when you get into super physiological IGF-1 in adulthood?
That's a good question, right? Because you're going to have spurts when you're growing up, and yet we don't have a bunch of cancer. It's a horrible argument, though. It's so circumstantial. Like, okay, but there's a lot of other processes that are happening and not happening that might have broken down along the way and all that. But from what we can gather at this point, I think the current consensus is growth hormone will not create cancers, but certainly if you have extant cancer, it's going to speed up the growth. That's a no-brainer.
Okay, so yeah, probably if you have cancer, you should be a little bit more cautious. And then I've certainly heard the argument conversely that lower IGF-1 may be anti-aging, and it's documented in the research literature that SERMs lower IGF-1 to some degree. Now, the authors of those papers say it still remains within the normal range, so it's not of concern. But I'd love to hear your take a little bit about IGF-1 and anti-aging.
Well, locally here, Peter Vongo, I think he's at USC associated. He does a lot of work with fasting. Great work, by the way. But I think he would clearly, I think he does in his book, state that IGF-1 is linked to morbidity and mortality, and the lower the better. And he cites the group off that, the Lazarus group off the coast of Ecuador, the island, and knockout genes for it and all that stuff. I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that he uses to support his position. You have to remember, just like we do studies on Worcester rats, which are basically fat type 2 diabetic rats, which don't represent necessarily the population, or do, depending upon where the way you're designing your study, I guess, and who you want to treat. You've got a lot of people in this country who already have fatty liver, for example. 100 million people we're estimating, and are very close to, if not, diagnosed with type 2 diabetes too. So is having more IGF-1 going to be a problem for those people? Probably. I liken it to having two sets of bacteria sitting there in a petri dish. If you pour a bunch of sugar in one and not the other, you're going to get more. That's a lousy example. Let me withdraw that one. But so in real life, without an analogy, if I've got, say, a guy working on an oil rig all day, or a fisherman in the summertime in Alaska, I think he's going to make use of the IGF-1 his body's producing to help keep his tendons and ligaments healthy, to regenerate his organs, which is probably going to need more of, during those nights, if he gets a chance to sleep, if he's a fisherman in Alaska, or when he's working on the rig. You follow me? So the regenerative potential isn't like pouring extra sugar in the petri dish, was an example I was trying to get at, or in the analogy. It's used And if it's used, then how is it going to get into trouble? Is my point. If it, and I could be wrong. It's just, you're asking me, because we don't have a consensus.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of people who say, no, it's the elixir for, it's the fountain of youth. And there are those that say, no, the lower the better. I don't think you can broad stroke it like that. Like so many things, I think it comes down to individuals. I'm trying to make a case for how you might, tease that out. I think for most people, having a lower IGF-1 is probably better because, you ride a desk all day, you don't exercise. What do you need it for?
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think there's also evidence, real quick, to suggest there might be times in life at which it makes more sense to use it versus not. If you're riding a desk from age 35 to 60, and then at age 60 things are starting to fail on you, and you have more time to, say, walk and do things when you're 60, even if you don't, you could argue any potential risks at age 60 are worth it because the benefits, because the wheels have started falling off the wagon at some point, are worth it. Again, you can make arguments along those lines too.
Yeah, fair enough. So let's talk about hormones a little bit. Now, we recorded a whole podcast, so I encourage the listeners who are interested in testosterone optimization to check out the one that we already recorded.
But encourage me to minimize my hormonal responses in the meantime.
For sure. But there are some follow-up questions that I want to ask. There's other health influences out there. So, for instance, Peter Attia went on Huberman's podcast saying he no longer prescribes Clomid because he found that this desmaratrol, one of these cholesterol precursors, is increased, and this has never been characterized in the research literature, and it's a speculation that he's making that potentially that's not a good thing. And Dr. Kyle Chillette, I believe, also interviewed Huberman and said that he doesn't think SERMs are safe for long-term use. That's his personal opinion. But I'd love for you to potentially address these points, like especially if you can talk about your clinical experience using SERMs, whether clomid-tamoxifen or enclomiphene, and whether you've seen any long-term issues in patients.
Well, I'll keep it specific because, I plan on a general response to that kind of stuff anyway. But when it comes to, okay, let's start with Peter Attia's speculation. I didn't even know the word when you brought it up. So, because we talked about this earlier, I don't, if there's no research out there, then, you go back to buyer beware. To some degree, I think it is important to find a physician that you can trust. There is art to medicine, and you may or may not decide to listen to that sort of, we're calling it speculation because there is no science out there other than the theory, which is part of science, right? I've never heard of it. We've got years of research using clomiphene citrate without that kind of side effect that I'm aware of, and in my practice, I have seen no effect on cholesterol because I'm using. We're talking about a long time ago when I used clomiphene at all, and if I do use a SERM, it's typically either in clomiphene, one of the isomers of clomiphene citrate, or I use tamoxifen. So, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong or bad about whether it's a SERM or an AI that I'm aware of. I think it's more overdoing it, the effect of overdoing it, either lowering estrogen or blocking estrogen too much.
Right.
That's my opinion, and that's what I've seen based upon. Well, I can say it. At least I've stewarded at least 30,000 patients by now.
Yeah.
So I think that's a lot. That's a pretty big number, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not being Wilt Chamberlain. You can go back to the days when I was overseeing a lot of patients that were working way too hard. In all that time, the only time I ever saw an issue was if we oversuppressed estrogen. In doing so, I'd see a drop in HDL, which I attributed to that. Okay. When it comes to, what was the other one? So we're talking about enclomiphene on the one hand, and its effect on cholesterol, and then just in general, the use of SERMs?
Some people argue that SERMs should only be used short-term, probably for fertility boosting purposes, and they shouldn't be taken long-term for hormone optimization purposes.
Why not?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think some people are just in the TRT or is the only effective thing camp, but
Oh, well, that doesn't make sense either. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to use a SERM if you've got secondary hypogonadism works really, really well. So why would you necessarily go to TRT? I'm not saying you shouldn't, but the standard of care is certainly treat secondary hypogonadism for as long as you can before you switch and treat it, as primary, right? Not that that means that you should, but I'm just saying standard of care says that. That's not necessarily the science, it's just the way we do it. But yeah, again, I've never seen any negative effects from being on enclomiphene. I have some younger patients that suffer from secondary hypogonadism that have been on it for a long time, whether it's enclomiphene or, well, HCG is a totally different animal. But again, I don't think there's anything that I've seen, or whether in clinical practice or in the research, that shows there's something intrinsically wrong with the substance. We were talking about AIs earlier, and the original AI was letrozole. That was the first developed, and we saw some elevations in AST and ALT. I think it was ALT mainly, and so we developed anastrozole. I say we like I was part of it. I wouldn't. No, our profession or the pharmaceutical group did, and anastrozole didn't show those elevations, but an AI again doesn't have an intrinsic bad part to it. If you oversuppress estrogen with it, then you're going to have an issue. Yeah. So these fads I've seen, I call them fads. This comes up in the boards, whether it's the bodybuilding circles or all the health gurus out there, whether deserve to be titled health gurus or not. Even if I don't even know if it's a good thing, but whether they deserve to be followed or not, and that goes into a whole other thing about even if they're gurus. I mean, you can apply it to what we're talking about right here. Sure. We're doing our best to present the science.
Right.
Science changes.
Yeah.
And so that's a good enough reason right there to be your best advocate for yourself, to go out and say, hey, and I think I make the point in the book too, because if I, for example, with my spine, had been more sensible about it, I would have had more options. But I said, they don't have anything but a door hinge or fusion for my neck. I'm not going to do anything about it until 33 years later. I had no choice.
Right.
And so getting back to this, use what's out there as a starting point, but then do your own research, and maybe trust, look into a few gurus if you're going to go that route before you go any further. And the gurus should be, I mean, I don't mean to sound like a party pooper. Who cares? I mean, this is science, but there's a lot of smart people out there who know a lot of stuff. But shouldn't you start with a physician when you're talking about medicine?
Right.
It shouldn't be. I'm going to get a lot of grief for this, but I know a lot of great people that are great trainers, and I would go to them for a lot of advice about how to work out, because they're the doers of the world. They're in the trenches. One of my favorites recently is this guy Ross Edgley. Have you heard about him?
No.
So he swam all the way around Britain, never getting on land. Took him 157 days and about 7,800 or more kilometers. 694 bananas, something like that. It's a great book if you have a chance to read it. This is a guy that's a doer, and he knows a lot about what he's doing. I always say, and so he has some great advice because he's done it.
Sure.
The gym is a great proving ground. But for someone, the average person in the gym who says, this worked for me, who hasn't studied physiology, and Ross is an exception. You can tell he's done his homework. So push him aside. When they start explaining the physiology about it, it's laughable, right? And that's when you get into trouble, because you start to extrapolate from that, and you go, well, if that's the way that works, well, let me try this because that's what I read the way this works, and you can really hurt yourself. So again, take it with not necessarily a grain of salt, but go to the people that are trained in this area. Yeah. You and me both know that that's not always your best bet. There's a lot of physicians that are lazy and don't keep up to date, but where else are you going to start?
Yeah. And unfortunately, there's a lot of confusion and confounding things. Like a T actually doesn't have access to enclomiphene in his practice, so he doesn't have any personal experience with it. So the effect that he's talking about with Clomid probably doesn't apply to enclomiphene, because if you listen to our previous podcast, they're two different isomers. Clomid's almost like two drugs, if you will, an estrogen antagonist and estrogen agonist. So even if it does have that effect, it may in fact be due to the zuclomiphene isomer. So we have no evidence that actually that elevation happens with enclomiphene. And then similarly, the notion that you shouldn't use SERMs long term, I think a lot of that notion came from before even the advent of enclomiphene. And given how pure it is, how little side effects it has and how long it's been used. At least with Maximus, we have now thousands of patients who have been on it for multiple years. Very low incidence of adverse effects. And certainly, occasionally, if people have side effects, it usually discontinues as soon as they get off of it. So,
Come on, Dr. Lipschultz, who's, the godfather of this medicine over at Baylor University. The guy is approaching 80. God bless him, and he's still seeing at least 70 patients a day. I mean, he's got a lot more evidence than I do as to its efficacy and possible side effects. And this is not a diss on anybody. I mean, this was presented. I didn't hear it, but it's presented as a theory.
Yeah.
So but yeah, the point we're trying to make, I think, right, is that you got to dig in a little deeper than just well, maybe, and I think so.
For sure, yeah. Well, I don't want to focus too much on supplements and drugs, as interesting as they are. So let's talk a little bit on the behavioral side of things. So I believe in your book, you talk about really the best anti-aging intervention is exercise. And everyone knows they need to work out. But, I very publicly in social media talk about how sometimes these health gurus' exercise routines are completely unattainable because you got to be working out 10 plus hours a week to do all of the zone 2 cardio on top of your gym and all this stuff. So how can people get the 20-80? How can they put in minimal effort and get maximal benefit when it comes to health span and longevity?
I'm just laughing because I got to add, and this is not a slight, it's just, what was it, PX90 or something like that?
A P90X, yeah.
P90X. I remember my friend T.R. Goodman telling me he trains a lot of pro athletes, and that's all he does is for a living. And he was like, Fran, it's the craziest workout. I said, I got pro athletes that, would make it, maybe if they made it, would make it one day, and then they couldn't do it the next day. A lot of these things are teed up pretty, and I don't mean any, it's Tony Horton, right? I don't mean any slight on him. But just perspective, maybe a 20-year-old professional athlete could do it for a little while, but some of these things don't apply, certainly to me at 30. I'll leave it at that, right? So I'm not slighting anybody. But yeah, exercise I call is the great equalizer. Exercise can make up for a lot of things. The example I like to use is lack of sleep. It can destroy your insulin sensitivity up to 50%, just 5 nights in a row of lack of adequate sleep.
Right.
And yet, if you exercise, at the end of your shift, if you're only getting 5 hours, it seems to make up for it, at least temporarily.
Yeah.
Right? It activates the innate, it creates NAD, which helps activate the sirtuin genes. It can, it can have the same effect as fasting in the sense that, you can check your ketones and see. If you do an hour on the bike, and whatever, at your anaerobic threshold, your FTP, then I'll bet you're pitching a bunch of ketones in your urine, and that activates a lot of processes we're trying to do. So, you could skip some meals or grab your exercise, and then or both, So, exercise, I think, and certainly we have so much control over that, assuming that we're catching it early enough, meaning this whole process in life, that we're not debilitated to the point where we can't get exercise. That would be a sad day for me.
Sure.
I think for most. So that's something I think you want to preserve for so many reasons, not just the freedom of mobility, but because of its great effects, which is a big part of the book that I try and make something other than just something great grandpa might have told you and said, yeah, sure, roll your eyes. Okay, what about the latest and greatest? These things we've talked about so far, we haven't really harped on sleep, but nutrition and exercise and sleep, as well as the connectedness part, are the basis. The rest of it is just fine tuning.
Right.
So if you take your polyphenol supplements, whether it's EGCG and curcumin, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what we're talking about right here.
Right.
The basics, and in part of the purpose of the book was to show the science behind those basics, like the lack of sleep, and the studies showing that it creates as much as 50% reduction in insulin sensitivity. So people don't just go, oh yeah, that's what my great grandpa said too. No, this is tried and true. Ditto for the exercise, ditto for the nutrition. You start there. So,
So with the exercise specifically, I'm sure it's like nutrition where there's not a one size fits all.
Nope.
But if someone was starting out, what do you think is the most potent exercise or a non-negotiable exercise regimen that someone should do?
How about if I focus on the latter? Because potency brings up, how about HIIT? You can do 20 minutes. given what you said about the individuality of it, I would say for most people, generally speaking, again, generally, the non-negotiable part would be the LSD, I call it long, slow distance, the zone 2 training daily. Pretty much anybody, unless you're wheelchair bound or something, but even wheelchair bound, you can get some exercise, right? I mean, whatever it takes. The zone 2 is what we find in most centenarians, whether it's gardening or in Finland, getting your sauna in, whatever. You can even call that exercise. It simulates exercise, that heart rate of a zone 2 or less. I think if you had to choose, that is probably the best in terms of bang for the buck, okay, in terms of all the physiological benefits. That said, there is certainly an association, a correlation between longevity, healthy longevity, health span, and VO2 max. Ditto for muscle strength and muscle mass, which generally all three of those you don't necessarily associate with LSD, right, but HIIT, right? So arguably you need both, a little of both. And one or the other is not enough. But what's more achievable for most people, probably arguably the zone 2 or below.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about sauna. So right now it's all the rage. People are doing the sauna, ice bath, and switching back and forth protocols to spike their dopamine, potentially spike their growth hormone. Is there really much like clinically meaningful benefit to doing some of this stuff, or should they be doing like cryotherapy and probably like more advanced things?
Bunch of stuff comes with that question. Let's not forget about noradrenaline, the rush you get with that too. The heat shock proteins, whether you're using heat or cold. I know you go, wait a minute, I'm using cold, I'm getting heat shock proteins, yes. And the protective benefit you get from heat shock proteins. I would say that just like, using metformin, or better, I guess, with NAD instead of exercise, no. And so if you can get the exercise, you're way better off than if you sit in a sauna. Okay. But, I mean, that's why in Finland, I'm sure it's more comfortable to sit in a sauna during the winter than it is to go traipsing around in, 40 below wind chill. I don't know for sure because I don't live there, but I'm just making an educated guess. That said, even if you were doing your cross-country skiing in Finland, there's good purpose for the sauna for what we call, approximating what we call active recovery, where you're getting some of that zone 2 effect, even though you're not training, you're not doing the gardening, especially if you're in Finland in the winter, or something equivalent though, you're getting blood flow, whether it's in cold or not. Because remember, the cold is temporary. You come out of the cryotherapy and your body reacts. Why do we have red cheeks when we go out in the sun? Because your body reacts and says, oh my God, it's too constricted. Did I say sun? Sorry, out into the cold. Your body reacts and you get the rubefacient reaction as the blood vessels open up. And so you're pushing out the old, which could be full of literally toxins or cytokines that you may not want there, the bad kind of IL-6, not the good kind. And you're moving the fresh, nutrient-filled blood into the area. It's a very general way of looking at it, right? But it's kind of the way it works. And, in terms of a fad, if you can take advantage of both, I think is a good thing, right? But if you had to choose, are you asking me that? I'd try and...
Well, not if you had to choose. It's just like, for instance, the U.S. Olympic Training Facility doesn't recommend daily ice baths because it inhibits inflammation and it might actually impair hypertrophy. So they save it for post-competition and injury, for instance. So I was just kind of curious.
Well, but if you dig a little deeper into that one, that's a great... see, this is why it's so much fun, because the devil's in the details. The studies I've read show that, if it's within the first hour, or maybe it might extend to even 2 or 3, then you're hindering the very thing you're trying to create. Enough inflammation to stimulate your body to say, hey, this is going to happen the next time. We're going to be better than that, right? Progressive resistance training, or however you want to look at it. But if you go beyond that, then it can be very beneficial for the reasons I said. You're flushing out the stuff you don't need anymore to be in place and replacing it. And whether it's massage or this, which can effectuate things similarly, heat or cold, there's definitely benefit from it. But the timing is everything, like you say. Yeah.
And you have a cryotherapy machine here in the office. I've actually tried it on occasion. Can you just talk about your clinical experience? Like, what do you observe in your patients that use cryotherapy, and what are the use cases?
The easiest thing to observe is a change in attitude. It's attitude adjustment, man. 3.5 minutes and you're on cloud nine, because there's no sort of blocking it out by saying, "Oh, I'm going to focus on the fact that I got to go to work today and work till way too late," or, I've got bills that are mounting, or whatever it is that's bugging you. You're focused on, "Hey, Zeus, this is cold in here,"
Right.
right? I mean, in mine, it's 150 below typically. And the wind's circulating in there, and it gets your attention.
I call it forced mindfulness.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there's terms for it, and from a mental standpoint, right? That's what I'm harping on. You can probably describe it, not probably, definitely way better than I can. But I just notice it from the outside looking in. People walk out of there and they go in kind of mopey, or maybe even a little apprehensive. They come out going, "Yeah," beaming, because again, that noradrenaline release, your body says, "What in the heck are you doing, man?"
Right.
And you get your blood going no matter what, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are, I think, very interesting and exciting tools, and hopefully there'll be more and more research that potentially corroborates some of the clinical observations that you're noticing.
Well, and that's what I detail in the book. The things I mentioned earlier, like the heat shock proteins, whether it's cold or hot. Noradrenaline can be very therapeutic. I mean, it's part of the antidepressant medications we use now, the NSRIs. Right? Again, I'm talking your field. You can address it much better than I can. But you are doing something physiologically, not just putting a smile on your face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One topic that we touched on at the end of our last podcast, I think I kind of asked for your potentially controversial opinion. You talked about potentially the use of anabolic androgenic steroids in the elderly, and I believe it was to potentially offset the frailty that happens. Obviously we lose muscle mass as we age, and people often fall and break their hips, and that can lead to their demise. I'd love to hear your professional opinion about that. When should someone, as they're getting into that stage of life, potentially consider that? Because steroids are taboo often in society. Maybe it's because of the negative connotation that comes with the illicit use in the bodybuilding community.
Or getting an advantage on your fellow competitor.
That's
right?
true.
I think that's probably a big one too.
So talk about responsible steroid use.
Yeah, let's talk about medical use of something that has a very definite benefit. If you start with what you started with, further it, I guess, the fourth leading cause, and of course this always changes, fourth leading cause, as far as I know today, of death is accidents, right? So take that person who falls, who's 80, let's say, okay, breaks a hip. I think it works still the same way. If you don't die within 3 days of that, then you didn't die from the hip.
Yeah.
And yet I would argue you do if you die 3 weeks later from hospital-acquired pneumonia.
Right.
Okay, it's because you fell and broke your hip, all right? That would probably bump it up into the number 2 place overall in terms of, causes of death, or darn close if not.
Yeah.
So it's a big factor here, the frailty that occurs, and we all know it's coming with older age. Now, the stigma, who knows how it started, okay? But it's interesting because we talk about it, you just said it, steroids.
Right.
Well, steroids are anything made from cholesterol.
That's right.
Vitamin D, which we call a vitamin, even though it's a steroid, it's a hormone, okay?
I call it hormone D. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and let's see if it catches on. But, whether it's testosterone, estrogen, DHEA, progesterone, pregnenolone, these are all categories of steroids. An anabolic steroid is a hormone that's not naturally occurring, that emphasizes the anabolic effect, the muscle accretion effect, rather than the other things that are valuable too. Okay. Now, the problem with anabolic steroids, unlike testosterone or dihydrotestosterone, the basis from which many of these anabolic steroids are made from, is that they come with some side effects, all of them. Again, we can say all, this time. Lowering your HDL a bit and raising your HDL a bit are what happens. Okay.
Your LDL.
Raising your LDL. In addition, a lot of the oral anabolic steroids, you'll see AST and ALT, which are considered liver enzymes in most circles, first anyway, will also be oftentimes mildly elevated depending upon the dose. Really quickly though, AST and ALT, these so-called liver enzymes, can also be elevated by a bunch of other reasons, including muscle tissue breakdown and turnover, which is what happens when you're on an anabolic steroid. So if you get a GGT, which is specific to organs like the liver, pancreas, biliary tract, whatever, and notice that the GGT is not elevated, but AST and ALT are, then maybe we could assume, and therefore take away some of the stigmas, what I'm getting at, attached to these anabolic steroids, that it's from muscle tissue rather than some negative effect on the liver. And some of them do, like halotestin, which is still on the formulary, is legal, in other words. And really, I hate to say this, well, I'm going to say it to make a point. You got to be an idiot to prescribe halotestin, because it does have negative effects on the liver for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, but most of these don't, and if they do, it's mild. So anyway, taking away the stigma,
Yeah.
I hope. More importantly, again, like we were talking about with you reach a certain age with IGF-1 and growth hormone being elevated or not, why wouldn't we want to protect someone who's getting frail for whatever the reasons are, and give them something that can help keep them alive and injury-free longer? Okay. Yeah. It's not a freebie, by the way. Okay, you still have to be able to exercise. If you go on testosterone, which has anabolic properties, or an anabolic steroid, and sit behind your desk, you're not going to get increased muscle mass. You still have to stimulate. You just increase the ability of the body. I use the word all the time. You leverage the body's ability to accrete muscle.
Yeah.
So it ain't a freebie. I wish it were, because it would help a lot of sick people or frail people.
Right.
But the point is, we could help out considerably if we could detach ourselves from the stigma.
Yeah.
And get her done.
Is there times that you would prefer to use an alternative steroid other than testosterone?
Yeah. Perfect example is a female who has estrogen-sensitive cancer. The DHT derivatives, we call them, like stanozolol or oxandrolone, and we can't get it in this country, but it's another injectable form of a DHT derivative that works great. It's called Primobolan. Everyone knows it as Primobolan. Are great in that they can't convert to estrogen.
Right.
So a female can get the same effects that she needs to maintain her energy, her libido, her sense of well-being, her muscle mass, okay, which after you've had cancer, oftentimes cachexia is associated with it, or during. To me, again, it's a no-brainer. So let's stop the legends, the stigma, and dig into the science of it. It's a fantastic alternative because you can get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're also, by using it, even if, let's say she's a 45-year-old female, unfortunately, that has estrogen-sensitive breast cancer, okay? You're stopping her own production of testosterone to a large degree by using let's say oxandrolone. People know it as Anavar because that's the old name from G.D. Searle back in '62, the trade name. So you stop or you downplay the body's ability to make testosterone, therefore any substrate from which estrogen can be made, as well as provide a replacement that from which estrogen can't be made. It's I mean, it's not genius, but come on, what a great solution. And yet you tell that to an oncologist, not all of them, because the tides have changed, but they look at you like you have 14 heads.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, hopefully that'll advance, and I'm glad that you're doing that. Last topic that I really wanted to discuss is integrating all of this advice into your life. I mean, one of the concerns I have, because I'm a clinical psychologist and psychiatry professor, is the encouragement of obsessive compulsive behavior when it comes to biohacking and longevity, because a lot of the folks that are really passionate and enthusiastic about it are high performing type A personalities, and they get a little overbearing, I would say, when it comes to this. And I empathize, because there's so much advice, right? If you listen to all of these podcasts, you'd be taking 150 supplements and doing 500 different behaviors. And it's hard for people to process all of this in terms of like, okay, but what do I actually need to do and implement? Yep. So what's your advice for patients and that allows them to obviously implement some of these, improve their quality of life without becoming obsessive compulsive, annoying their wife and impairing the social, connections that are probably the most important thing for longevity.
It's a great question. I don't think I've thought it through until you bring it up right now because it's a different angle. But yeah, I mean, you definitely, if you're OCD about it, I mean, the obvious ones are don't get an Oura ring, don't get an iWatch that has the ability to track your heart rate and your sleep, okay, which is the main reason I suggest an Oura ring. Don't track your HRV because it could drive some with OCD nuts. It drives, I don't think I have OCD, but it can drive me nuts. Why? Because I think you have to either spend a lot of time researching it and tying it together yourself, or you find somebody who's, we'll say, an expert in the field to help tie it together. Because, for example, if you followed HRV as an athlete, you wouldn't get another workout in. Because if you're pushing it, which you are most of the time in a training block, right? You'd read your HRV, which real quick is your heart rate variability, which will be less because your sympathetic tone is higher. If you're in a hard training block, your body's not getting quite enough rest. So HRV would tell you, don't train today or take it really easy today. Well, you wouldn't get anywhere.
Right.
And so that alone, you'd be like, well, wait a minute, I'm supposed to get exercise. I'm trying to get in good shape, but this thing tells me not to. It'll drive you nuts right there. So you have to know which things to pay attention to and when. And by the way, you could even, I mean, there's a lot you could do to just throw out HRV altogether. We're not sure it gives you all that much great information anyway, just as a quick side note. But yeah, teasing out the good from the bad in general, and then, okay, this is good right now, but I don't really pay attention to this until off season, or this overrides this more. I think you have to, again, either self-educate for a while or find those of us out there that like this, love this stuff. And, am I the best at this? Heck no. But, I definitely have a passion for it and love it and want to do it. And I'm not trying to sell myself, but I'm saying, as an example of someone who loves this and has some background in it and studies it on purpose and a lot, I can't tell you all the answers. We're still trying to find them out. You and I were talking about, because I was trying to dig some information about lactic acid in an athlete that's 6'1", 235 pounds, trying to be an endurance athlete, just to see if because that's, we're still trying to figure this stuff out. So again, going back to the theme about being your own best health advocate, you got to find out what works for you and decide, okay, this is useful information, but this really doesn't work for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always tell, even the patients that I work with, it's important to just monitor and track things. Don't just take them on, even sometimes based on research or advice. Like, you have to see if it works for you and document whether it's doing blood work or even just feeling writing down your energy levels every day to assess if that intervention is actually making some sort of impact on your life. And if it's not, you don't feel a need to obsessively, overutilize it. Because in the end, if it's not noticeably moving the needle, then it's probably not going to make a huge difference anyway.
Yeah, or if it's hindering your progress. Have you ever used HRV? I know you have for at least for a while, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have an 8 sleep, and so it tracks it every night. And I can't tell you that anything I've done has ever made a difference on it. So
I can tell you, I've been told by that HRV program, and I'm not dissing any particular program. It does its job. But if I listen to it, if I interpret it the way it wants me to, man, I would have missed some great workouts. Because I have a coach, and he says, this is your workout today. And so I have to do it whatever the HRV says. Yeah. And I've had some great workouts despite what the HRV said. So yeah, you gotta find your way.
Yeah, I was just sharing this article on social media. I can't remember the woman's name, but she's one of the top ultra marathoners in the world. She beats the men oftentimes, and they asked her about her routine, and it was hilarious. And she was just like, "Yeah, so my nutrition comprises of like mostly pizza and nachos before and after races. I don't have an HRV monitor. She's just very intuitive and listens to her body, and she's very sophisticated actually about it. Because I was like, I think some of these tools can be useful to educate people about the basics, but when you talk to often actually like elite level athletes, a lot of them are become so attuned to their body that they're their own HRV monitor, and you can tell when you're off and you're well rested and you're not, and you adjust your workout naturally. And so I think it's great. Obviously, I'm very data driven, just like you. We do lab testing as part of our protocols and all that, and it is important. There's time and places for markers, but that's not to ignore our own subjective intuition and feelings as well.
And those are the guys and gals you want to look to, I would argue, at least as a starting point. That's why I mentioned that guy, Ross Edgley, because here's a guy who's breaking all the rules. He laughs I haven't heard him laugh. I can picture him laughing as he writes this stuff down, because yeah, the guy eats like a scavone, as we would say, if that's an Italian word, when he wants to, when it's appropriate, because he's in tune. And I mean, you gonna argue with a guy who just swam around Britain?
Right, yeah.
Okay, or climbed the length of or the height of Everest on a rope in 24 hours. I mean, the doers of the world. And he's not the only one, obviously. He's just in my mind recently because I just found out about it. But those are the guys I would say start with. He said, well, I'm not an Olympic athlete. Okay, but these are the guys that are doing it at its best. You know, do you want to go to a mechanic that deals with Ferraris and Toyotas, or just Toyotas? With no disrespect, but you get my point, right? Yeah. I think I want the guy that knows the high performance as well as the good old Chevrolet, car. And I think they make a great point too. I mean, did you ever see footage of Muhammad Ali going, "Oh, wait, Angelo, my heart rate's up a little too high. I think we should slow it down today." There's something to just knowing what to do, right? And if we could get there, that would be the ideal. But until that point, yeah, you and I are both slaves. I admit to it. You do too. To data-driven stuff. I mean, what better way to at least try and get there?
Yeah, balance the quantitative with the qualitative. I think that's really important. And I think that's a great final note to kind of leave things on in terms of your advice to be a doer, right? I think one of the dangers in the overloaded information age that we have, as great as the internet and social media is sometimes there's too much information, and sometimes I see patients who spend more time consuming about how to be healthy rather than being healthy. And I'm like, obviously listen to this podcast, and we encourage education and self-education, but you can get a lot out of, and this is, by the way, why I love books, and I'm obviously being promotional here, but our lead investor, Keith Rabois, who, is a Midas list investor, talks about the great thing about books and long form podcasts is that they have great information density, right? You can get a lot out of just reading this, and I got through this in probably 6 hours, and so spend a little bit of time educating yourself, and spend the majority of the time doing and practicing, because the best diet and exercise and longevity routine is the one that you can implement and stick to forever.
Yeah, and it works for you, sure, because it works for you. Yeah. Absolutely. It reminds me of the old line in the gym, right? Hey man, you're not getting any better thinking about it sitting over there on that bench, right? You got to do it.
That's right. Yeah, and in these days, people are on their phones too much at the gym. So focus on how you're feeling in between your sets instead of scrolling on your iPhone there. So awesome. Dr. Rand McClain, his new book, Cheating Death, The New Science of Living Longer and Better. Highly recommended. We touched on a lot of the topics in the book, but if you really want to get into the details, highly recommend you get a copy. You can find it on Amazon in both paperback form and Kindle if you're trying to save paper. I highly recommend you check it out, and thank you again for being a guest as always.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Awesome.